Hey, hi guys, how are you all? I hope you all are doing good. So, here I am today with the super quick revision of economic laws, the most awaited ones, as you all call it as. These videos are applicable for the November 21 examinations. Along with these videos, make sure once you're done with the super quick, you are supposed to also go and refer the amendment videos which I have put up, which is to be done in addition. Okay, amendments videos have to be done in addition. I have used my 7th edition book, which is applicable for the same November 21 examinations. I have used the same book while doing this video. If you have, well and good. If you do not have, and if you wish to purchase, then you can just take it from the website arpitatulsian.com. It's available there. And yes, so I'm going to cover each and every chapter of your economic laws. Just make sure that in addition to this video, you also see the amendment videos. Yes, so I think without wasting any time, we are good to go, and you can start with the super quick revision and promise me to give an exemption in law, everyone. And yes, thank you so much for showering so much of love on me since so many years. I'm really grateful for that. And if you like this video, do not forget to leave a comment. I love reading your comments. So yes, we are good to go. All the very best. Enjoy. Okay, so let's start with a super quick revision of the first chapter, that is Money Laundering Act 2002. The basic meaning of money laundering is where the person tries to earn any income, or where the person has done any such activity and he has earned any income from illegal sources, and that person tries to show or tries to portray as if the amount has been earned from lawful sources or legal sources. That is nothing but the act of money laundering. The main purpose, there are three main purposes of the act. First one is to prevent money laundering, that is to reduce such activities of money laundering, to do the confiscation of the properties which were involved in money laundering, and to combat, that is reduce the channelizing of money going into such activities. These are the three purposes of the act. Then money laundering is a single process. Money laundering is a single process with 3 stages which has to be done in this particular order only. First one is placement, second one is layering, third one is integration. Okay, placement means what? The activity has been done, the criminal activity has been done, the money has been earned by that defaulting person, and now that person wants to convert that money into legal sources. So the crime money gets injected into the financial system of India. After that, the money is layered. The money is layered over multiple transactions, over multiple accounts, maybe by depositing some small amounts in bank accounts or by purchasing some property out of it. And after this, your black money, or we can say your illegally earned money, gets mixed up. It gets mixed up with the legally earned money, and therefore it becomes very difficult to find out the original source from where did we earn this illegal money. So these were the 3 stages of money laundering, that is placement, layering, as well as integration. When we go to definitions, the most important definition here would be money laundering. Yes, in case of money laundering, ideally the definitions are given in section number 2, but the definition of offense of money laundering is given in section number 3. How do we define this offense of money laundering? If there is any person who is directly or indirectly indulged in this activity, or who is knowingly assisting, or who is knowingly a party to this activity, or who is actually involved in any process which relates to a criminal activity, which is connected with proceeds of crime, and that person is trying to conceal it, that person is trying to acquire such proceeds of crime, that person is trying to possess such proceeds of crime, and that person is trying to project as if this is an untainted property, means that person is trying to portray as if it is a clean property, then all such persons would be guilty of the offense of money laundering. Okay, one new explanation inserted was this activity of money laundering is a continuous activity. It is a continuous activity, means that person will be liable for the offense of money laundering not till the time he is directly holding that particular asset, but till the time he is enjoying the proceeds from this particular asset. Till that time, this person will be guilty of the offense of money laundering. Now, in case of money laundering, first of all, the most important thing is there should be a criminal activity. The criminal activity should be relating to your scheduled offense and you should have earned some proceeds of crime from that. Okay, so now let's try to understand what do we mean by proceeds of crime. Proceeds of crime means any such proceeds which you have obtained either directly or indirectly by doing some criminal activity, and it includes the value of the property, whether it is located in India or whether you have taken the property outside India, doesn't matter, but the entire value of property that you have derived from such criminal activity which relates to the scheduled offense, that will be treated as proceeds of crime. So ma'am, what do you mean by the term scheduled offense? Scheduled offense means there is a list of offenses given in the schedule attached to the PMLA, which is divided into three parts. That is part A of the schedule. All the offenses are listed in part A of the schedule. There are few offenses which are listed in part B of the schedule, but that person will be liable for the offense listed under part B only if the amount involved in the offense is more than or equal to rupees 1 crore, and that person, and all the offenses which are specified under part C of the schedule. Any offenses which are written in these three parts, part A, part B, part C, all these are treated as your scheduled offense, and if you do any offense relating to that, means that you are involved in that criminal activity, and if you have earned any amount from that criminal activity, means you are guilty of the offense of money laundering. Okay, so means any property that you are deriving from such criminal activity, that becomes your proceeds of crime. So now property means what? Property can be anything. It can be any kind of asset, any description of asset, whether tangible, intangible, whether movable, immovable, whether corporeal or incorporeal, means material, lesser amount or higher amount, whether located in India, whether located outside India, doesn't matter. Everything will be included in the term called as property. Okay, in this particular chapter, a very important weightage is going to be given to the banks and financial institutions, to whom we are cumulatively going to call them as reporting entity. Okay, reporting entity includes your banks. Banks includes your scheduled banks, cooperative banks and all those. Plus, reporting entity is also going to include your financial institutions. Ma'am, who all come under this term called as financial institutions? So, in your financial institutions, you have got all the financial institutions as defined under the RBI law. Then you have got your NBFCs, you have got your chit fund companies, you have got the Department of Post, you have got a housing finance company, you have got a authorized person under FEMA, that is money changer under FEMA. Then you have got a payment system operator, the intermediaries who are there when we do any payments, etc. All these people are included in the term called as financial institution. Just remember the point, Department of Post in this financial institution. So till here we are done with section number 2 and section number 3. Now if any person is guilty of the offense of money laundering, then that person will be punishable under PMLA. How that person is going to be punishable? Just close your eyes and imagine those two branches. By default, the punishment will be fine of any amount and imprisonment ranging between 3 years to 7 years. Okay, and if that person has done any offense which pertains to Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1985, then that person will be liable to a fine of any amount and imprisonment which is going to range between 3 years to 10 years. Just remember, this is not a contravention, but this is an offense. So this is going to be determined by the special court at a later point of time. From section number 4, I am jumping to section number 11A. We are going to do it from 11A to section number 12AA, which talks about your KYC requirements in case of reporting entities. First of all, section number 11A, the crux of section number 11A is every reporting entity before it does any transaction with its clients, it has to make sure that it does the verification of the identity of its clients by any of the 4 methods. Okay, first method is authentication under the Aadhaar Act, that is your biometric, thumb impression and all those things. Okay, this is by default allowed only to banks and not to every reporting entity. Okay, by default it is allowed only to banks. Next one is your offline authentication under Aadhaar, that you submit the Xerox copy of your Aadhaar and all those things. Third one is by use of passports, and fourth one by any other valid central government document, that is it can be PAN, it can be voter ID, driving license or whatever has been authorized by the central government. Now the first point was actually applicable only to banks, but then the central government may allow, it may say that even the other reporting entities, if they follow the privacy standards, if they follow the security standards, and if they consult the UIDAI, Unique Identification Authority of India, if they contact them and if they consult them, then in that case even the other reporting entities can do the authentication, that online authentication by the Aadhaar mode. Okay, then whenever suppose if any person is not having Aadhaar, then the reporting entity should allow the clients to do the authentication by other modes also, because this is going to be a voluntary choice of the client and not of the reporting entity. The image of the details of the Aadhaar, the thumb impression, the retina scan images cannot be stored in the system. The copies of your documents can be stored, but the digital information about your identity cannot be stored in the system. This was all about your section number 11A. Going on to section number 12, which is very important, which talks about obligations of the financial obligations of the reporting entity. There are three broad obligations of the reporting entity. First one, every reporting entity will have to maintain the record of transactions for a period of 5 years from the date of transaction. Okay, next, whenever the director asks for it, director means the enforcement director, whenever the director asks for it, the reporting entity is obliged to furnish this information to the director. And the third one, the reporting entity is required to maintain the record of all the documents for a period of 5 years after the business relationship has ended or after the account has been closed, whichever is later. So these are the three obligations of the reporting entity. But yes, the director, the enforcement directorate has to make sure that all the information has been kept confidential. Okay, and any kind of exemptions can be provided by the central government. Since this is a central act, it is going to be regulated by the central government. So if any exemptions have to be provided, then those can be provided by the central government. This was all about your section number 12. Going on to section number 12A. In 12A, I had just told you to remember three things. Okay, the director may call for the information. The director may call for the information from the reporting entity. If the director calls for the information from the reporting entity, it is the duty of the reporting entity to provide that particular information to the director. And every information which has been sought by the director, that should be kept confidential. This is what we studied in section number 12A. Going on to the next section, that is section number 12AA, which was talking about enhanced due diligence only in case of specified transactions. That is high value transaction, forex transactions, high value imports, cash deposit or withdrawal exceeding a particular limit, etc. In such cases, PMLA tells the reporting entity to exercise enhanced due diligence, that is to be more alert about these types of transactions. How do we become more alert? First of all, we have to do the verification of the identity. Either if that person has Aadhaar, then do it using Aadhaar. If not, then other modes of identification has to be used. Next one, take more efforts and try to find out about the ownership and the financial position about your client. That from where is he earning the income, what is his financial position, and all those things. And third thing, try to find out the purpose about this particular transaction, why your client has to do this type of transaction. If you are okay with all the answers, no problem, you can tell your client to go ahead with the transaction, but just keep an eye on him, just keep a scrutiny on the transactions that he is doing. Plus, whatever information you have gathered about him, please maintain it for a period of 5 years from the date of transaction. Whatever extra information you have obtained during this due diligence, maintain it for a period of 5 years. But if you think that either of the three conditions, any one of the three conditions is also not getting fulfilled here, then please don't allow your client to enter into that transaction, because anyway the transaction was a high value or a very risky transaction, and at the top of that you are not able to satisfy the conditions. So you should not allow your client to enter into such transactions. This was all about your section number 12AA. Going on to the next section, that is section number 13, which talks about powers of directors. Powers of directors have been broadly classified into 3 points. First one, director has got the power to do inquiry. Either the director can do it suo moto, or it can do it when someone came and made an application to the director. Director can tell the reporting entity to get its books of accounts audited by a chartered accountant. Expenses of that will be borne by the central government, and this is in addition to the statutory audit. that was applicable to that particular reporting entity. And the third one is, suppose if the reporting entity or its employees or its directors, if they are not listening to the enforcement directorate, or they are not listening to the directors, or they are not fulfilling the obligations, then 4 points can be made applicable. First, we can issue warnings to them in writing. We can tell them to comply with certain instructions. We can tell them to do periodic reporting so that we have a hold on them. And last, if nothing works, then we can impose penalty on them ranging between rupees 10,000 to rupees 1 lakh for each failure, right? And this will be done with every reporting entity who is not listening to the director. So this order will be passed on every particular reporting entity who does not listen to the director. Acha. But when section number 14 just provides the cover, okay, section number 14 just provides the cover to the employees of the reporting entity, etc., that when we asked for the information to them under section number 12, second point, when we ask for the information, and if they do not provide us the information, then they can be liable for penalty, but no civil or criminal proceedings will be applicable. Means no case will be formed on them, but penalty can be applicable, right? And then in section number 12 itself, okay, in section number 12 itself, remember we had to maintain the information for 5 years and all those things. So how to maintain it, in what format are we supposed to maintain it, how are we supposed to furnish it, etc., all that manner will be provided by the central government after consultation with the RBI. Okay, that will be provided by the central government after consultation with the RBI. This was all about your provisions relating to reporting entities. Now going on to the main provisions of the money laundering, which talks about provisional attachment, confiscation. Okay, I am taking all these provisions together. I am trying to take all these provisions together. Just keep your minds open. Now, first let's talk about provisional attachment. The power of doing provisional attachment. Is available with the director or other directors, but not below the rank of deputy director. And if it is, if it is not the director, and if it is done by lower level directors, then they'll have to take the authorization from the directors. If they have any reasons to believe with them, if they have some material in their possession with them, that so and so person is having some proceeds of crime, and this person is trying to transfer it, this person is trying to conceal it, this person is trying to use it, possess it, etc., then the director can decide to provisionally attach the property which he thinks that it is involved in money laundering. But one formality that is applicable is, before doing provisional attachment, it has to make sure that it goes and submits a complaint or a report to the magistrate or the court before doing the provisional attachment. But exception, in some emergency cases, if it is not possible to immediately go and file the complaint with the court or the magistrate, then in that case, first you can do the provisional attachment, then you can fulfill that formality. Okay, once provisional attachment is done, within a period of 30 days, the director is going to intimate this fact to the adjudicating authority that, sir, see, this is the material and we have done the provisional attachment. Once the provisional attachment is done, the provisional attachment is going to be valid for a total period of 180 days from the date of provisional attachment. In between, if there is any stay by the High Court, then your 180 days will be extended by the exact number of days of stay plus ad hoc period you are going to get of 30 days. Okay. And suppose once your time period of provisional attachment gets over, then the provisional attachment gets vacated. Okay, it does not get automatically renewed, but it gets totally vacated. What happens in case of provisional attachment is, it's just that you cannot transfer the property to anyone else. You are still the owner, you can still hold it, you can still use it, everything can be done. It's just that you cannot sell it off. Okay, after provisional attachment, the matter goes to the adjudicating authority. Ma'am, what is this adjudicating authority? Adjudicating authority is given in section number 6. It is constituted by the central government. It has one chairperson and it has 2 members. Those members should be having knowledge in the fields of LAFA, that is law, accounts, finance, administration. Then the matter goes to the adjudicating authority for adjudication under section number 8. Okay, when it comes to the adjudicating authority will see the data which it has received from the director. If it thinks that yes, actually it involves proceeds of crime, then the adjudicating authority will issue a notice to that person asking about the sources of assets, like from where did you purchase this particular asset, and plus it will issue a show cause notice that why we should not declare as if these properties were involved in money laundering. Okay, if the property is co-owned by multiple people, then the notices will be issued to all. Okay, and the person has to reply within a period of 30 days. If that person replies and the reply is a satisfactory reply, then the game is over, Goa gone, chapter closed, then no money laundering ka case is there. Okay, but if that particular person does not reply, or the reply given by that particular person is not a satisfactory reply, then the adjudicating authority will take a call and will treat that person as guilty. If that person is treated as guilty, then the attachment order is passed. Okay, and now the case is going to move ahead. This attachment order, which was passed by the adjudicating authority, this is valid for a period of 365 days. Okay, so now the matter, when it goes to the special court is going to do the investigation and will find out whether confiscation is required or not. And that has to be done by the special court within a period of 365 days. Suppose in between, if there is any stay by the High Court, then we will get an extension only of the exact number of days and not the ad hoc 30 days. Right? Acha. Suppose if suppose I am one of the co-owner of the property and I was not at all aware about all this money laundering thing and all. So if I prove my fact, or if I prove my innocence before the special court, then I can be safeguarded, I can be saved, and I won't be liable for any punishment. And even the amount that I have put into my property, into that co-owned property, I might get that much amount from the special court, if at all special court is convinced with my explanation. Okay, acha, once confiscation happens, once confiscation happens, the property gets vested in the central government, but central government will simply take your asset and not your liability. If there is any liability attached to that particular asset, it is still my liability, it is not the government's liability. Once the asset goes to the government will appoint a person called as administrator to take care of that particular asset, that is to sell it, to auction it, and for all those things, a person called as administrator is appointed. Okay, then going on to the next section, that is section number 11, adjudicating authority, the person who did this attachment thing, etc. This person has got all the powers as vested in a civil court. Okay, means he is regulated by the code of civil procedure, that is calling for any information, discovery of documents, examination of any person on oath, taking evidences on affidavits, summoning any person. All these powers, whatever powers were there in a civil court, same powers are vested in an adjudicating authority also. Okay, so till there general provisions get over. Now let's go to the arrest provisions. Power to arrest, like we have studied in section number 4, that imprisonment is going to happen. So for doing the imprisonment, we'll have to first arrest that particular person. If you want to arrest that particular person, can I say director has got that power, deputy director has got that power, or any particular officer authorized by central government, they have got the powers. They do not even require an arrest warrant, and they can simply go and on the basis of information that they have, they can simply go and arrest any particular person after giving them the reasons for doing so. Once that person is arrested, we'll take that person to the magistrate or to the special court within 24 hours from the time of arrest. And this 24 hours, apart from this 24 hours, we'll even get the time that is required for traveling from the place of arrest till the court. Okay, and once you have arrested, once the director has arrested, director will simply intimate this fact to the adjudicating authority that I have arrested so and so person. Going on to the next part of the chapter, that is appeals. If, say for example, if the reporting entity is aggrieved by the order of director, or if, say for example, that person concerned is aggrieved by the order of adjudicating authority, or if director is aggrieved by the order of the adjudicating authority, then we have got an option that we can go and file an appeal to the appellate tribunal, within a period of 45 days from the date of receipt of order. If we could not file the appeal within a period of 45 days, then in that case the delay can be condoned if we have got a sufficient cause. Okay, then after that, appellate tribunal under this PMLA is not formed. So we take the appellate tribunal from the Smugglers and Foreign Exchange Manipulators Act 1976. Once the matter goes before the appellate tribunal will give opportunity to both the parties. Appellate tribunal may confirm the order, it may modify the order, it can set aside the order, and once it takes the decision, it will give its orders to all the parties who were involved in the particular case. And AT has to dispose of the case as soon as possible, and it should try to dispose of the case within a period of 6 months. If we are not happy with the decision given by the appellate tribunal, then we can even go and file an appeal before the High Court. That appeal can be filed on the question of law or question of fact. That appeal can be filed within a period of 60 days from the date of receipt of the AT's order. If there is any sufficient cause, then the delay can be condoned, but by a maximum period of 60 days only. And we cannot tell to the High Court that you have to dispose of the case within so and so time. Okay, then talking about the appellate tribunal also had all the powers as vested in the civil code, but it was not restricted only to civil code. It can be regulated by its own procedures also. It can make provisions for itself also. Plus, it will be guided by the principles of natural justice. Natural justice means it has to compulsorily give ROBH before it passes the final order. Okay, now this appellate tribunal is also just like a court only. Okay, it is just like a court only. It functions in forms of benches. So this one bench is going to have one chairperson and it is going to have two more members. Okay, if there is any dispute between these two members, then by default we take the decision by way of majority. But if there are only two members, then what is the way out? Either the chairperson will involve himself, or the chairperson will put one more member, which makes it total 3, and then we will take a revised majority, and then finally the decision making is done. Okay, whenever you present any case before the appellate tribunal, whenever your appeal case goes before the appellate tribunal, and if you do not know how to, represent yourself, etc., then you can appoint a legal representative or an authorized representative on your behalf to go and represent the case before the appellate tribunal. And if the government is one of the party to the appeal, government can appoint officers called as presiding officers who are going to act as their authorized representatives. Right? Then one important thing, civil court is not going to have any interference in between, because see, for provisional attachment we have got directors, for attachment we have got adjudicating authority, for confiscation we have got the special court, for appeal we have got the AT and the high court. So there is no need of any other authority. So the civil court cannot interfere in between. It cannot interfere with the powers which have been given to the other authorities listed under the law. Okay, then after that, the next one, that is special courts. Like, what is the role of the special courts and what is the purpose of formation of the special court? So in every particular jurisdiction, we are going to have special courts. Special courts are nothing but the session courts. Okay, central government, after consultation with the Chief Justice of High Court, they designate session courts as special courts for respective jurisdiction. The main purpose of the special court is to do speedy trial of offences. That is fast, doing the trial of the offences. For the purpose of this chapter, special court is going to try the offences of section number 3, and it is going to announce the punishment under section number 4. Right? But for that purpose, obviously, we'll have to go and give the cognizance. We'll have to give a note of that particular offense to the special court, and then only special court will consider that particular case. And suppose if before special court the case was with any other court, example, before special court the case was with the session court, and later on the special court was established, so the case gets transferred. So conclusion, if you have a special court, then the PMLA cases will be dealt by special courts only. Okay, next important section, that is section number 45. All the offences under PMLA are cognizable and non-bailable. Cognizable means you can arrest any particular person without an arrest warrant, and that person cannot be released on bail. This is the by default provision, but for the purpose of releasing that person on bail, we have got a few exceptions. Okay, first one, the public prosecutor should be given an opportunity to oppose the release. And suppose if he opposes, but still the special court is of the opinion that no, this person should be released on bail and he won't commit any new offense while on bail, then that person can be released on bail. Okay, another thing, say for example, if that person is under the age of 16 years, or if that person is a woman, if that person is a sick, if that person is an infirm person, or if that person along with a co-accused person, if he has been convicted of an offense of less than rupees 1 crore, then in that case, if the special court thinks fit, then that person can be released on bail. Okay, for all these things, the code of criminal procedure is going to be applicable. But for arrest without warrant, we do not have any exceptions. Means that person can still be arrested. Without warrant. For bail, we have got these small exceptions. Right? Public prosecutor is a person who has got 7 years of experience, who has been practicing as an advocate for at least 7 years. Okay, then after that, all these authorities, that is your directors, we have got hierarchies in directors. You have got the director, you have got the additional director, you have got the joint director, you have got the deputy director, you have got the assistant director. All these directors are there in the hierarchy. Okay, the lower level authorities, that is the assistant director or the deputy director. Assistant director or deputy director, they have got the rights, okay, they have got the powers to do impounding. Okay, but if they want to, impound the documents, impound the records, or take it into their custody for more than 3 months, then in that case, they'll have to take the prior approval of the joint director, because these people are a little lower level directors. Then after that, going on to the cross-border implications thing. Okay, first of all, there is something called as contracting state. Contracting state means any country or any territory outside India with whom our central government is going to enter into an agreement for exchange of information and to make the provisions of the PMLA applicable in the other country also. For that, first we'll have to make sure, we'll have to find out whether it is an offense of cross-border implication or not. Ma'am, how do we come to know that it is an offense of cross-border implication or not? For that purpose, first point is where the conduct has been done outside India. Some person has done the criminal activity outside India and the proceeds of crime should be actually transferred to India. Then in that case, it is treated as an offense of cross-border implication. Okay, or if, say for example, the offense has been done in India, and either you have actually transferred the proceeds of crime outside India or you have tried to transfer the proceeds of crime outside India. Then in that case, that becomes your offense of cross-border implication. How to deal with this cross-border implication? For that, we need to have an agreement with a foreign country. That is called as a treaty. Ma'am, why do we need an agreement? Because we want to enforce the provisions of our act in the other country also. Because we want to exchange information. Okay, for that purpose, why do we want to exchange information? Because we want to prevent such kind of offenses. We want to prevent such kind of offenses in our country also, and we want to prevent the offenses as per the laws of the other country also. And plus, for the purpose of investigation of cases, we will require information, and that's why we enter into a treaty. Now, if we want information, if we want to get it enforced, then we will have to take their help. Okay, sometimes it can so happen that even we will have to provide them the necessary help. So, first case is when we send them a letter of request. When the director, enforcement directorate is of the opinion that some information is not available in India. So that person goes and makes an application to the special court that, sir, this information is available outside India only. And if the special court is satisfied, then it will issue a letter of request to the government of the other country and ask for the information. Okay, similarly, vice versa thing can happen. Our central government might receive the letter of request from the other country. Okay, and once it receives, then the central government will pass on to the special court and special court will help the other country by providing the necessary information. Okay, similarly, say for example, if I want to arrest a person who has been sitting outside India, if I want to issue a summon to a person who is sitting outside India, if I want to, make some search and seizure happen on any person outside India, I cannot do it directly. Okay, I will have to issue a letter of request to the other country's government, and that can happen only via the court or the judge or the magistrate of the other country. I cannot do it directly. And for these purposes, having a treaty with the foreign countries is a must thing if you want to implement the prevention of money laundering provisions in the other country. Okay, now coming on to the punishments. In punishments, we are going to see two sections, that is section number 62 and 63. Okay, in section number 62, say for example, if any particular authorities of the law, if they have done vexatious search on me for time pass, for fun, and they haven't even recorded the reasons for doing this, then in that case, they will be liable for punishment, imprisonment up to 2 years or fine up to 50,000 or both. Okay. Suppose if someone has given false information about me, then that person, not the authority, but the person who has given the wrong information, that person would be liable with the same punishment under section number 63(1). Okay, and if any person is disobeying to the authorities, means authority has called any person, he did not go, authority had asked for some information, we did not submit, authority had told us to sign any document, I did not do it, means I have disobeyed. So I will be liable for a penalty. I will be liable for a penalty ranging between rupees 500 to 10,000 for each failure, but this will be imposed only after giving me a reasonable opportunity of being heard. Okay, and suppose if I want to go to the special court for the purpose of 62 and 63(1), for the purpose of 62 and 63(1), that is where I want to, make this punishment applicable on them, then I'll have to give the cognizance to the special court first. I'll have to give the note to the special court, and before that also, I have to take the prior approval from the central government. And central government will either accept it or will reject it within a period of 90 days. And for all these things, the provisions from the Code of Criminal Procedure will be applicable. Okay, then the last few miscellaneous provisions. Now, if the enforcement directorate or the other authorities in this particular chapter, if they have got certain information that maybe the person is involved in drugs thing, the person is involved in forex thing, that person is involved in some other smuggling, etc., then the directors have got full right that they can share this information with the other authorities. That is not called as breach of confidentiality. Okay, we can also seek information from the other authorities, plus we can even share the information with the other authorities. Okay, that does not lead to breach of confidentiality. Then whatever penalty, whatever fine is levied on us, we have to make sure that we pay it within a period of 6 months from the date of imposition. Okay, we have to pay it. If we do not pay it, then that will be recovered as per the income tax provisions. That is by selling of movable property, selling of immovable property, by freezing the bank accounts, etc. Those things can be used. Then another point was, next point is about offenses by companies. Suppose if any company is held guilty of the offense of money laundering, then all the person in charge of that particular company at the time when the offense was done will be deemed to be guilty of the offense of money laundering. But suppose if they prove that this happened without their knowledge, suppose they exercised all the due diligence, they did not exercise any negligence, and this did not happen with their consent, then in such cases they can be safeguarded. But otherwise, by default, all the person in charge of the company will be liable. Okay, suppose if we have any contravening provisions, regarding money laundering, in money laundering as well as some other act, then always just remember Money Laundering Act is going to override. Okay, suppose if any aggrieved person, means the person on whom we had a doubt that he is involved in money laundering, suppose if that person passes away, okay, then in that case, imprisonment is waived off. In case of death, imprisonment will be waived off, but the fine will be recovered from his legal hire or legal representative. Okay, in case of insolvency, that person will still be liable for imprisonment, but the fine will be recovered from the official assignee from his estate. Okay, suppose if we wanted to file an appeal, but before that itself that person has passed away or that person has become insolvent, no problem, the case will be continued, the appeal can still be filed. In case of death, the appeal can be filed on behalf of my legal hire or legal representative. In case of insolvency, it can be filed by the official assignee. This was all about your money laundering chapter, and with this we are done with the super quick revision. I hope you are very, very clear with this. Okay, so let's start with the super quick revision of Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996 as amended by the Amendment Act 2021. Arbitration and Conciliation Act is going to mainly talk about three things broadly. First one is about domestic arbitration, second one is about international commercial arbitration, and the third one is about enforcement of the awards, enforcement of the arbitral award, that is the decision which is given by the arbitrator. Section 1 of the Act says that the entire law is now applicable to whole of India, including the state of Jammu and Kashmir. The entire chapter, the entire act is divided into 4 parts. The first part is going to talk about arbitration. The second part is going to talk about enforcement of the awards. The third part is going to talk about conciliation. And the last part is going to talk about the supplementary provisions. This is the broad breakup. This is the broad breakup of your entire Arbitration and Conciliation Act. But when we talk about the coverage from our exams point of view, we have got major provisions from arbitrations, and we just have got the overview of conciliation. This is what is the coverage for our exams. Now, this particular law, Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996, this focuses on alternative method of dispute resolution. Means instead of the traditional method, that is instead of going for litigation, we have got alternative methods here, that is either you can go for arbitration, or you can go for mediation, or you can go for conciliation, or you can go for negotiation. These are the multiple methods. These are the various methods of alternative method of dispute resolution, out of which the two most common methods followed in India Two most common methods followed in India is, first one is arbitration and the other one is mediation. Conciliation is not very popularly followed in India because of the features of the conciliation process. Okay, so the two most common things, methods are arbitration and mediation. And when we talk about the advantages or when we talk about the disadvantages of this alternative method of dispute resolution, when we talk about advantages, so as compared to litigation, this is a polished way of dispute resolution. This has got a speedy method of dispute resolution. Here the cost involved is comparatively lesser. Here the confidentiality involved is more. Here the flexibility which is available to the parties is very high. But at the same time, when we talk about the disadvantages, then in that case, all the parties must consent, all the parties must be capable or flexible of doing this dispute resolution by this alternative method. Everyone should be of that cooperative nature before before you enter into such type of agreements. Sometimes it becomes difficult in enforcing the awards, because when it comes to courts litigation thing, at that time it was a court judgment which is to be enforced. But when it comes to arbitration, sometimes it is not given that much importance as we give it to a court judgment. Then it depends on the behavior of both the parties, the cooperative behavior of both the parties, if you want to enter into this alternative method of dispute resolution. So by balancing the advantages and disadvantages, the parties are at a freedom whether to decide whether they want to go for this alternative method of dispute resolution or whether they want to go for this litigation thing. When we talk about alternative method of dispute resolution, these are regulated by three laws mainly. The major provisions or the main provisions are covered in Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996, then it is covered in the Code of Civil Procedure 1908, and then it is covered in the Legal Services Authorities Act 1987. These three laws taken together are going to cover the provisions of your arbitration and conciliation. We had studied that we have two most common methods of alternative method. One is arbitration and mediation, and out of that also the most popular method, the most widely followed method in India is arbitration. Now let's study about arbitration. In case of arbitration is nothing but it is a way by which the disputes are resolved. The disputes between the parties are resolved by a neutral third party, by an unbiased third party who is called as the arbitrator, and he is the one who gives the final decision, and that decision, in legal language, that decision is called as the arbitral award. Then we have got 8 pointers. Coming in basic features of arbitration, which is very, very general. For arbitration, first thing which is mandatory is the arbitration agreement. Arbitration agreement has to be expressly there. A valid, clear arbitration agreement is to be there between the parties who are going to be there in the dispute. In case we do not have an arbitration agreement, then we cannot start with the arbitration process at all. There are two types of arbitration agreement. One is arbitration clause and the other one is called as submission agreement. Arbitration clause is something where a clause about arbitration, that we are going to resolve the dispute by way of arbitration. This thing is going to be there in the principal contract. Okay, and suppose if we do not have such a clause in the principal contract, then we can enter into a separate agreement to resolve our dispute by way of arbitration, and that separate agreement is called as the submission agreement. Either of the two works well. So first one, arbitration agreement is mandatory. Second one, for doing this arbitration, we need to have a person called as arbitrator. He is the person who is going to adjudicate, who is going to take the decision, who is going to resolve the particular disputes. This person is called as the arbitrator, or we can even call this person as an arbitral tribunal. You can use the names interchangeably. This person can be a neutral, this person has to be a neutral person, this person has to be an independent person, and this person has to act unbiased in all the cases. Next important point is something called as seat of arbitration. Seat of arbitration is nothing but the choice of law that we want to make applicable in our case. Either you can select the Indian laws if you want to take supportive measures from the Indian judiciary system, or you can select with the foreign seat also, or you can select with the foreign law also. Here we have got the party autonomy. Okay, which is going to be the next point here. Party autonomy and procedure is such a feature which is one of the most important feature of arbitration also, as well as of conciliation also, because here the parties have got full freedom to choose their arbitrators, to decide upon the number of arbitrators, to decide where the arbitration proceedings is going to be conducted, what is going to be the seat of arbitration, how are we going to conduct the proceedings, whether it is going to be by oral arguments only or by written arguments. The parties have got full freedom to decide all these things. Next, 4 points are done. After that, the next one is finality of outcome. The final decision which is given by the arbitrator, that is full and final, and that is going to be binding. That by default that cannot be challenged, but it can be challenged on certain grounds. Okay, the grounds for challenge is going to come in the later part of the chapter. Suppose if the decision given is totally biased decision, if the arbitration agreement was an invalid agreement, or say for example the decision given is totally illegal decision, then there are certain grounds on the basis of which we can challenge the award, challenge the decision which is given by the arbitrator. Then after that, the next point that we have got is confidentiality. In case of arbitration plus in case of conciliation, confidentiality is mandatory. Confidentiality has to be maintained. It has to be maintained by the arbitrator plus even the parties who are involved in this particular dispute. Okay, the conclusion of the arbitration agreement, the conclusion of the arbitration process is going to be the arbitral award or the arbitration award. That is nothing but the decision which is given. And now you can link this arbitral award point with the finality of the outcome. First we get the arbitral award, and then we know that the arbitral award which has come out, that is full and final, and that is going to be binding on all the parties who are concerned, and just in certain cases the award can be challenged. Then after that, the last point, that is enforcement of arbitral award. This point is very, very simple. Just like a court's judgment, even a decision which is given by the arbitrator, this is enforceable by law, and it is enforceable because of the provisions of the Code of Civil Procedure 1908. But by chance, if the final award is influenced by bribery, by fraud, by corruption, then in that case the award will be stayed and the award will be totally treated as illegal. The award will be stayed, means it cannot be enforced now. It will be stayed, it will be stopped. Then after that, something called as arbitration in India. For that we have got three bifurcations. Arbitration in India, we have got three bifurcations. First one is judicial authority. Second one is court, to whom we are going for filing an appeal or for asking for supportive measures. And the last one is the court, to whom we are going for appointment of arbitrators. Okay, first let's take the first point. In the first point, we have got the judicial authorities. Judicial authority is a very broad term which includes court, which includes special tribunals, and which includes quasi-judicial authorities, that is just like court authorities. Okay, all these are included in the term called as judicial authorities. Going to the next point about court. Okay, here we are going to district court and high court. Okay, here we are going to district court and high court. At any point of time, whenever we require court's help or whenever we want to challenge arbitral award, at that time we'll go to these particular courts. In case of domestic arbitration, we can go to district court and high court. In case of international commercial arbitration, we'll have to go to the high court only. And suppose if we are not able to appoint the arbitrators, we'll study this in the further part, that if we are not able to appoint the arbitrators, then last resort is we can take the help of the court who can appoint the arbitrators for us. And in case of domestic arbitration, the arbitrator will be appointed by the High Court, and in case of international commercial arbitration, the arbitrators would be appointed by the Supreme Court. Okay, so this is how these particular courts are there when we talk about arbitration in India. Next, starting with the next part, that is your arbitration agreement. Okay, arbitration agreement is a mandatory thing. Suppose if you want to get your disputes resolved by way of arbitration, which is a private method of resolving the dispute. It is not a public method. It is a confidential method of dispute resolution. For that, first of all, the parties have to consent. Okay, the parties have to give their consent that yes, they want to resolve this dispute by way of arbitration. So consent also becomes a very fundamental thing. And to document all these things, to write all these things, we are going to prepare an agreement called as arbitration agreement. There are two types of arbitration agreement. We have already discussed about it. One is your arbitration clause and the other one is your submission agreement. Okay. Another important thing is this arbitration agreement has to be mandatorily in writing. There is no specific format of this arbitration agreement, but it should be a valid and expressly put up contract which has been signed by all the parties, in the dispute, and it can be exchanged. It can be exchanged by way of normal documents. It can be exchanged over emails. It can be put up in the terms and conditions. It can be in any mode, but there should be an express agreement between the parties that yes, in case of disputes, we are going to resolve our dispute by way of arbitration. Okay, then in your textbook, you're going to get something called as types of arbitration agreement, which we have already covered. Now, a few basic principles, a few general principles of arbitration agreement. 5 points are going to come up there. First one, there should be an arbitration agreement. There should be a proper contract. So, if it is a contract, it should fulfill all the requirements of a valid contract from the Indian Contract Act. Okay, next one, consent is mandatory. Without consent, you cannot enter into arbitration. Means a single party cannot solely go and enter into arbitration. It has to be consented by all the parties who are there in the dispute. Next one, important point, that is ouster of jurisdiction. Ouster of jurisdiction means none of the parties or neither of the parties can solely proceed to the court if they have entered into arbitration agreement. Means if you have entered into arbitration agreement, make sure that you stay here only. If you want to get out of this arbitration agreement, it can be done mutually but not unilaterally. Okay, then after that, the next point which is coming up here is doctrine of separability. And the next point, that is competency to rule on its own jurisdiction. These 2 points are interrelated. Doctrine of separability means even though arbitration agreement is included in the principal contract, then also both of them is going to have a separate legal validity. Principal contract will be treated as separate contract and arbitration agreement will be treated as a separate agreement, even though it is included in the principal contract itself. So even though the principal contract is treated as invalid, the arbitration agreement will not be treated as invalid. It will still be treated as a valid agreement only, even though it was contained in the principal contract itself. So here we can conclude that the arbitration agreement has a separate legal validity, and the arbitrator can still perform its duties even though the principal contract has been treated as invalid. So it is totally independent. Okay, it is totally independent of the principal agreement. Then after that, we have got a few requirements. Okay, we have a few requirements of a valid arbitration agreement. Very simple pointers are there. First of all, arbitration agreement has to be in writing. Mandatorily, it has to be in writing. There is no specific template or format or a form for that, but it has to be in writing, and it should be expressly written that we wish to resolve our disputes by way of arbitration. Next one, clarity of consent should be there. No ambiguity should be there. It should not be vague. Okay, it should be very clear that yes, we want to enter into arbitration agreement. Words called as may should be avoided there, because if may word comes, then it is directory. It is not mandatory there. Then after that, the disputes which are submitted for arbitration, those disputes must be legal. Okay, those disputes must be legal. Example, cases relating to kidnapping, murder, bribery, etc. These are already illegal by nature. So these cannot be settled by way of arbitration. Then the conclusion of this arbitration agreement will be the award, the final and the binding award, which is going to be applicable on all the parties who are sitting in the dispute. Mere use of words, arbitrator or arbitration in any particular document does not make it as a valid arbitration agreement. For making a valid arbitration agreement, you have to compulsorily have clarity of words in your agreement that yes, this is a valid arbitration agreement. So just mere use of words called as arbitrator, arbitration, etc. will not make it as an arbitration agreement. For entering, the purpose of entering into arbitration is dispute. Either there should be an existing dispute for which we have entered into an arbitration agreement, or there are chances of a future dispute for which we are entering into an arbitration agreement. Okay, and these disputes must be arbitrable. It should not be excluded from the Arbitration and the Conciliation Act. Example, I had told you about child custody matters, or say for example when we talk about divorce matters, etc. These are excluded from the purview of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. So those cannot be dealt by the Arbitration and the Conciliation Act. And the last one, this arbitration agreement has to be signed. Arbitration agreement has to be signed by all the parties. Okay, it has to be signed by all the parties between whom there is a dispute. Then after that, the next one, there is something called as arbitration agreement through reference. Okay, say for example, in our agreement, we have written in my classes terms and conditions or admission form, I have written that all the disputes between the students and between the classes will be solved by way of as per the terms and conditions of the Maharashtra Class Owners Association. I have not written directly that whether it will be solved by way of litigation or by way of arbitration, but I have referred it to some other person, or I have referred it to some other document. And now when I go and refer that particular document, it's written there that the disputes will be solved by way of arbitration. I have not directly written in my document, but it has been referred to some other document. So then also the agreement will be treated as valid, provided it is clearly written. It should not leave any doubts in the minds of the reader. If it is clearly written that yes, it will be solved by way of arbitration, no problem, this will be treated as a valid arbitration agreement. Then there are certain cases, there are 4 cases when your arbitration agreement gets terminated. Okay, 4 cases or 4 ways by which your arbitration agreement gets terminated. We'll assume it as 3 plus 1. Okay, we'll assume it as 3 plus 1. First one is if all the parties have mutually decided. Okay, if all the parties have mutually consented, then in that case, the arbitration agreement can be terminated. Next one, termination of principal contract. Suppose if my principal contract comes to an end, it has not become invalid. If it comes to an end, then even the arbitration agreement is going to come to an end. Or suppose if by operation of law, if suppose the law says that this matter cannot be dealt by way of arbitration, these type of cases cannot be dealt by way of arbitration, then if law says, then in that case the arbitration agreement will come to an end. And suppose in case of death of the parties, the arbitration agreement does not get terminated and it continues against the legal representative of the parties. Okay, so this was all about your arbitration agreement. Okay, now let's go to the next person. Till now we studied everything about the agreement. Now let's study about that particular person, that is your arbitrator or the arbitral tribunal. So he is the most important person who is going to play the key role, because he is going to adjudicate the disputes. He is going to decide upon the disputes. He is the person who is going to give the award. This person can be called as an arbitrator, or this person can be called as an arbitral tribunal. No issues in that. The words can be used interchangeably, right? The best thing here is the parties who are there in the dispute, these parties get to select their own arbitrators. Means we can select our own arbitrators. We have got that party autonomy to select our own arbitrators. This person is just going to act as a judge. He is not exactly a judge, but he is going to act as a judge. That is, all the parties will submit all the documents, evidences. They are going to have some discussion, and then they are going to take a decision on the dispute about which they are for which they have entered into this arbitration agreement. But the most important feature here is this person has to be neutral at all the times. This person has to be fair. This person has to be independent. This person has to be unbiased at all the times. Then only the quality of the final outcome will be good. Okay, and whether the arbitrator is good or not, that is ultimately determined on the basis of the award that we are going to get there. Now, who can be an arbitrator? Any person who is capable of contracting. Means if I am eligible to enter into a contract, then in that case, yes, I am eligible to become an arbitrator. I should be having all those required qualification, experience. I should be fulfilling all the norms as given in the regulations. We do not have the qualifications, but the qualifications as given in the regulations must be fulfilled. Then in that case, I can act as an arbitrator. Yes, and the arbitrator should also give his consent. The arbitrator should also give his consent that yes, he agrees to be an arbitrator for our particular case. Now, how does the arbitrator gets appointed? This is very, very simple plus very, very important. First of all, the parties have got the right, they have got the freedom to choose their arbitrators. We can appoint whatever number of arbitrators we want. There is no issue in that. But the number of arbitrators should not be an even number. Okay, it should not be an even number, because then there can be a dispute amongst the arbitrators themselves. Forget about our disputes. There can be a dispute between the arbitrators themselves. So the number should not be an even number. Okay. Now, should we appoint lesser number of arbitrators or should we appoint more number of arbitrators? That depends from case to case. Okay, suppose if we appoint more number of arbitrators, then the cost involved will be more, the time taken will be more. Okay, the number of opinions that would be coming, that would be more, but at the same time the quality of the outcome would be really good, right? But at the same time, suppose if we appoint lesser number of arbitrators, then in that case the time taken would be less, the number of opinions involved would be less, but then again it would affect the quality of the outcome. So depending on case to case basis, we are supposed to balance it, and the parties will only determine that how many number of arbitrators should be appointed, right? Then now, first of all, suppose if you are not able to decide, how many arbitrators to be appointed, then in that case just proceed with a single arbitrator. That would be sufficient to start the case. How to appoint the arbitrators? Okay, now there are four methods. There are four methods of appointing the arbitrators. First one is both the parties will mutually appoint the arbitrators. Okay, I will suggest one name, the other party accepts it, or vice versa. So we mutually appointed. Second method of appointing the arbitrator is I appoint an arbitrator, the other party appoints an arbitrator, these two arbitrators together appoint the final arbitrator. That is the second way. Third way is I will send a list of arbitrators to the other party. The other party has to select from it. If the other party selects, then well and good. If the other party is not able to select, the other party will send me a list. And this exchange of list is going to go on till the time we don't agree on a common arbitrator. And last, if we are not able to appoint the arbitrator by either of these means, then in that case we can simply go and make an application to the court, and the court can appoint an arbitrator for us. Okay, High Court or the Supreme Court can appoint the arbitrator for us, and the arbitrator who is appointed by the court is totally that cannot be challenged at all. Okay, that cannot be challenged at all. Then after that, the next point, that is requirements of an arbitral tribunal, or what are the minimum basic things which is required in a particular arbitrator. First of all, he should be capable of contracting. That is very, very important. He should fulfill all the requirements of the Indian Contract Act, and he should be capable of contracting. Otherwise, he cannot become an arbitrator. Forget about the further process. He should be totally unbiased. He should be independent. He should be neutral. He should be fair at all the points of time. And the last one, he can be of any nationality of either of the parties. Okay, suppose if it's a case of domestic arbitration, then we generally go with an Indian arbitrator only. But suppose in case of international commercial arbitration, that arbitrator can be from the other nationality also. That is either of the nationality of the parties. Then after that, the award which is given by the arbitrator, can it be challenged? So the answer is yes, it can be challenged. Can we even change our arbitrator? Can we even remove our arbitrator? Can we even, raise a question on the arbitrator that we had appointed? Answer is yes, that is also possible. When is it possible that we are not happy with our arbitrator? Suppose if he loses interest in the case, or suppose if we can see that he will not be able to resolve the case within a period of 12 months. Or say for example, we come to know that he is acting biased. How will we come to know that he is acting biased? Maybe he is having some relationship, or he was having some past relationship with either of the parties. So in that case, we get a doubt that whether he is acting independent or not, whether he is acting partial, whether he is acting impartial, we get a doubt on that. Okay, more points where we can get a doubt is maybe if he is having blood relations with either of the parties, maybe if he is having some employer-employee relationship with either of the parties, maybe if he is the lawyer of either of the parties, or he is having any financial interest in either of the parties, or say for example, he is a legal representative of either of the parties. So these are certain pointers which give rise to doubts that yes, biasness is present. Okay, it's not necessary that because of these points biasness will be 100% present. No, but we can have a doubt. We can get a doubt if either of these points are present. Okay, now there will be certain responsibilities also, there will be certain duties of the arbitrator also, there will be certain liabilities of the arbitrator also. Even he has to act diligently, even he has to apply his brains while he is giving the judgment. Okay, what are those points? Now, first of all, he has to solve the case as expeditiously as possible without doing any sort of delays. Okay, all the unnecessary delays etc should be avoided, and he has to try to dispose of the case as early as possible. He has to remain impartial at all the times. He should not favor a particular party. If he does that, then the entire process becomes futile, and in that case you cannot proceed with the award. He has to make sure, along with the parties, even he has to make sure that he maintains confidentiality, because confidentiality is a very important point in case of arbitration as well as conciliation. The award that he is giving, that should be a speaking order. That should be a reasoned award. That why has he given this particular award, he should support it with the required reasons. It should be a detailed award there. He has to avoid unilateral communication, communicating only with one party. No, that should be totally avoided. Okay, that should be totally avoided. Then he has to make sure that whatever documents are received from one party is communicated to the other party. That is communicated to the other party, so that everyone is kept in that particular loop and no one would feel that partiality is going on. Then the final award which is given by the arbitrator, that should comply with the legal requirements. Means he should not say, hey, just go and do the murder of that particular person. No, that is not a legal award. Right? And the award, and even during the time the process was going on, during those times also he has to make sure that all the legal requirements are fulfilled. Okay, even during the process he should not indulge himself. Even during the process he should not indulge himself into any illegal activities. These are the duties and liabilities of the arbitrator. Now, next, can the arbitrator be terminated? Answer is yes. Can the arbitrator be removed? Answer is yes. Can the arbitrator voluntarily get out of the process? Answer is yes. Can we replace the arbitrator? Again, the answer is yes. When, in what all circumstances can this thing happen? Now, say for example, if the parties mutually decide that we should change our arbitrator, maybe if he is not having proper expertise, maybe if he has lost interest in the case, maybe if we have already sensed that he cannot complete the case within a period of 12 months, he is not having that proper expertise that we require in our particular case, then in that case we can voluntarily remove the arbitrator. Okay, we can mutually remove the arbitrator. Or the arbitrator himself says, hey, I don't want to handle your particular case, then in that case even he can voluntarily get out of this particular case. Or say for example, if the arbitrator has passed away, or the arbitrator is ill for a very long period, some due to health issues etc, because of which we know that the case cannot get completed within this period of time. Or say for example, if he is not able to, suppose 12 months have elapsed and he is not able to give the final award within 12 months, then he automatically, that leads to a deemed removal of the arbitrator. If the court comes and says that you lack independence, there is biasness, then the court can also remove that particular arbitrator. Okay, in all such cases, the arbitrator can be removed and a new arbitrator will be appointed. Ma'am, how do we appoint a new arbitrator again? So just like we appointed earlier by those 4 methods, just like those ways a new arbitrator can be appointed. Right? Then next, whatever is the decision given by the arbitrator, that can be challenged, right? That can be challenged. So before whom is it going to be challenged? So a different point is coming up here. In case of arbitration and conciliation, the first authority before whom it can be challenged is the arbitrator himself. Okay, we'll go to the arbitrator, we'll tell him, sir, we are not happy with your order, please reconsider it. So the arbitrator can reconsider it. If the arbitrator does not reconsider it, then the next level of appeal can be before the court. For domestic thing, it can be before the district court. For international thing, it can be before the high court. Okay, so these are your appeal authorities, and we can go and file an appeal before these particular authorities within a time period of 3 months, which can be further extended by a period of 30 days. Okay, and then whatever is the decision given by these authorities, that will be full and final, and that will be binding on all the parties who are there. Suppose if during these 3 months and 30 days, if there is any stay order by any court, by chance, if there is any stay order by the High Court, etc., then in that case, that much exact number of days will be extended and we get that extra time period. Okay, we get that extra time period within which we can we can go and file the appeal. Now, next thing is types of the arbitral award. This is important. There are 4 types of arbitral award. One is final award, next one is interim award, third one is settlement award, and the fourth one is your additional award. Ma'am, can you distinguish between all the 4? Yes. Final award means everything has been solved. Okay, all the disputes has been solved and which were issued to the arbitration, which were submitted to the arbitration, all those have been solved and the case has been closed. Okay, interim award means which is given before the final award is given. Okay, or say for example, when multiple disputes were submitted, then if the arbitrator plans to solve it one by one, then for each dispute it can give an interim award. Next one is your settlement award, where the parties themselves decide to come to a common conclusion without taking the help of the arbitrator. That is called as the settlement award. Okay, here the arbitrator is just going to approve it. He is not going to decide, but he is just going to approve it. So that is called as your settlement award. And the last one is your additional award. Additional award means, suppose where the final award was given by the arbitrator, but there were certain matters which were left out. Then once the final award is given, from that day within a period of 30 days, you can go and make an application to the arbitrator that, sir, so and so matter was left out. Please give us a decision on the same. Okay, that is nothing but your additional award. Now, few pointers about the award. The award which is given by the arbitrator, that should be a legal award. That should be given by majority of the arbitrators, not necessary by all. Okay, so it should be given by majority of the arbitrators and it should be signed also. It should be signed, it should be authenticated, it should be dated. And when it comes to signing of the award, it should be signed by majority of the arbitrators. By all, it is not required, because maybe the dissenting arbitrator, the one who does not agree, might not sign it. Okay, that person might not sign it. So the majority of the arbitrators will have to sign it. The decision which is given by the arbitrator should be a reasoned one. Speaking order should be there. It should not be vague. It should be very, very clear. It should be capable of being performed. I say, for example, I tell Mayur, I want stars from the sky. That is not capable of being performed. So in that case, that is not a legal award, right? Next thing, it should be legal. It should not be illegal. The arbitrator cannot tell me that go and do the murder of so and so person, go and bribe the other person. No, such type of awards are totally illegal. And the awards, as soon as it is delivered by the arbitrator, it should be enforced. Okay, and it should be enforced as per the Code of Civil Procedure. These are certain pointers. About the arbitral award. Now, we have already seen that the arbitral award can be challenged. Okay, first it will be challenged before whom? Before the arbitrator, and next it will be challenged before the district court or before the High Court. On which basis can we challenge it? Suppose if the arbitrator has done overstepping of jurisdiction, means he has gone beyond the law. Okay, then in that case it can be challenged. Or say for example, if the decision given by the arbitrator is biased, if it is not independent, then in that case it can be challenged. Suppose if we come to know that either of the parties were not in the capacity to enter into agreement, then too they have entered into the agreement. Example, later we come to know that some party was insane, some person was insolvent, some person was a minor, then in that case the entire process becomes waste. Okay, later if we come to know that the arbitration agreement was totally invalid, later if we come to know that this is such a dispute which was not allowed to be handled by way of arbitration, the award becomes invalid. For making it invalid, we'll have to go and challenge it before the court. Suppose if in case of international commercial arbitration, the decision which was given by the arbitrator is against India's public policy, then in that case it can be challenged. So these are some of the grounds on the basis of which we can challenge the arbitral award. Okay, once it is challenged, once it goes into appeal, what kind of decisions can be given? the appeal authorities can confirm the order, means they'll say everything is proper, or they can modify, means they themselves can do some small corrections in that, or they can set aside, means they will say that no, this is no more an award, this does not have any legal validity, go Goa, gone, zero. Okay, and the last one is remit back to the tribunal, means the court will give the case back to the tribunal that this order is not valid, now you will have to work again on it and you will have to rectify the defects. So these are the types of orders, appeal orders which can be passed by the appeal authorities, right? And as already discussed, in case of arbitration, the final decision which comes out, that is enforceable, just like a court's judgment, it is going to be enforceable, and for enforcement, the provisions of the Code of Civil Procedure is going to be applicable, right? Then after that, going to the last part of the chapter, that is conciliation. Conciliation is also one of the alternative method of dispute resolution. It is again a confidential method, it is again a private method, it is again a voluntary method by which the parties come together, they enter into a settlement agreement amongst themselves, and which is monitored, okay, or which is assisted by the conciliator. There are 5 characteristics of this conciliation. First one, it is a voluntary process, means the parties have to give their consent. They cannot be forced to come into conciliation. Next, the most important thing, that is non-adversarial. Conciliation vis-a-vis arbitration. The biggest difference here is here the parties do not compete against each other. They do not try to prove the other party is wrong. They try to bring all their disputes together. They try to solve it in a friendly manner, and which is overviewed, or which is assisted by the conciliator. So it is purely non-adversarial. It is a matured way of resolving the disputes. Next one, it is a assisted process. Means here the conciliator comes into picture, he sits, he observes, and he assists the parties to take a decision. He does not take a decision. Wherever the parties get stuck, he assists, and later on he approves the final decision which is taken by the parties. Okay, the final outcome here is called as settlement agreement or memorandum of conciliation, that is full and final, and that is going to be binding. And the last point, the most important point here also, is confidentiality. The conciliator as well as all the parties in your conciliation have to keep the matters confidential. Now, conciliation in India, how is it regulated? So it is regulated by 2 laws. One is your Arbitration and Conciliation Act, and the other one is Code of Civil Procedure. In case of conciliation also, only the matters which are legal, only the matters which are not prohibited by law, can be submitted for conciliation. How many number of conciliators? So number of conciliators can range between 1 to 3. Okay, 1, 2 or 3. That can be your number of conciliators, which will be decided by the parties, who will be appointed by the parties. If the parties are not able to appoint, then in that case we go and approach to the court, and then the court will appoint the conciliator for us. Okay, acha. Now say for example, if a particular matter is there into conciliation, then for that same dispute, you cannot go for arbitration, you cannot go to the court until unless, except in one case, that is when the rights of the parties have been badly affected, and just to protect your own rights, okay, just to protect your own rights, you plan to go for this arbitration or court. Only in that case it will be allowed. Okay, so now in conciliation, the parties are sitting there, the conciliator is sitting there, who is going to assist, who is going to approve. Once all these things are done, then after that the final award comes out. That final award is called as settlement agreement or memorandum of conciliation, and it is equally enforceable, just like your court judgment is enforceable as per the Code of Civil Procedure. The most important thing, the most important aspect here also is confidentiality. Okay, after party autonomy and consent, okay, after party autonomy and consent, the most important thing here is confidentiality. Everything has to be kept confidential. Suppose if we are jumping from conciliation to arbitration, then in that case, the conciliator cannot act as the arbitrator, and the process is going to start afresh. Okay, the process is going to start afresh. Then after that, How to define international commercial arbitration? International commercial arbitration is one such case where there is a dispute between two or more parties and where at least one of the party is of outside India. Either he can be an individual of foreign national, or it can be a body corporate incorporated outside India, or it can be an association who exercises its control and management outside India, or it can be a government of a foreign country as well. Okay, if one of the party is of outside India, then in that case it will be called as international commercial arbitration. Now say for example, now how do we distinguish? Okay, there can be distinguish between litigation and arbitration. It can be between litigation and conciliation. It can be between mediation and conciliation. It can be between mediation and arbitration. Okay, various combinations, or it can be between arbitration and conciliation also. So whatever points we have studied now, all those can be used here. And the basis for distinguish can be formed. But a few important points here is to understand the meaning of mediation. Arbitration and conciliation we know, but to understand the meaning of mediation. Mediation is such a thing where mediator comes into picture and he guides both the parties and he makes both the parties to agree on a particular decision. Okay, so the final outcome here is called as an agreement. It is called as an agreement. And if you breach that particular agreement, it leads to breach of contract. And if it leads to breach of contract, then the Indian Contract Act is going to be applicable there. Okay, and the provisions of mediation is contained in the Code of Civil Procedure. It is contained, unlike arbitration conciliation, it is contained in the Code of Civil Procedure. And in mediation, confidentiality is depending upon the parties. Means it is not mandatory to keep the matters confidential in case of mediation. So you can use these pointers and plus the concepts that we have studied till now about arbitration and conciliation to distinguish between different concepts. Then after that, we have got a few important case laws coming up here. First one is on that Narayan Prasad Lohia versus Nikunj Lohia, that generally even number of arbitrators are not allowed, but in a particular case even number of arbitrators were appointed, but we got a normal majority. Okay, we got a proper majority and the decision was taken. So Supreme Court had held that even though even number of arbitrators was there, which is wrong, but since you have got the decision, even number of arbitrators will be allowed. Okay, next we studied in case of SBP and Company versus Patel Engineering Limited, that in case the arbitrator is appointed by the court, then in that case it cannot be challenged. The parties cannot raise a question that no, this arbitrator is not a good person or something like that. Then next it was decided that in case of conciliation, two very important aspects are party autonomy, freedom to do anything, and consent. These are the two very important aspects. Next point was the settlement agreement which comes out in case of conciliation, that has to be mandatorily authenticated. If it is not authenticated, then in that case it is not going to have any legal validity. Okay, it is not going to have any legal sanctity there. Next one is nowadays the Supreme Court tells to the courts from different laws that please promote alternative method of dispute resolution so that the burden on the courts would be less and even the cases can be resolved in a better manner if people choose for alternative method of dispute resolution. And the last one, that is in case of international commercial arbitration, you cannot restrict, you cannot debar the foreign lawyers to come to India for conducting the arbitration proceedings. So they have full freedom to come to India and conduct the arbitration proceedings. Done. Are you clear with this, everyone?